This is our management audit for 2 Syracuse City schools by Karen Earl
and Jasmine Price.
The schools we studied were
PSLA at Fowler, which is a 9 through 12 high school.
And we also studied Edward Smith Pre-K to 8, which is a pre-K through 8th grade school.
We analyzed a few different topics. Those topics were schedule, discipline, communication, and testing. And we looked at all 4 in the 2 different buildings.
To aid our analysis, we came up with questions for each topic. They are listed here. For each topic, we will tell you a little bit about what's happening at each of our schools. Jasmine will first speak about scheduling at PSLA.
So for the schedule at PSLA, the principal sits down with a group of stakeholders and usually tries to make sure that everyone is represented when they sit down with these folks. So they want to make sure they sit down with a teacher who is an E&L teacher, someone who is a special education teacher, and so forth, to make sure that these different groups are advocating for the different students in our building. But one thing I found out about when I was asking the administrative staff these questions was that because we're a CTE school, career technical education, our schedule is driven by our different CTE programs. So that's one of the main priorities that drives our schedule. And then they look at special education and E&L needs and things like that. Those are also the barriers that they encounter when they're making the schedule as well. And there are a lot of resources for the students. When families and students don't agree with their schedule, they can meet with the principals and the vice principals and state their claim, but my principals tell me that at a certain point, that is cut off.
At Ed Smith, the process is a little different. When I became the instructional coach last year, the schedule was created by the vice principal and the instructional coach without input from anyone else in the building. When administration changed at the VP level, we created a team where there was a representative from each grade level who could come as well as special ed and E&L. However, the final schedule, the priorities that drive that are the instructional minutes that come out of elementary, as well as the number of teachers that we have at the secondary level, because we do not have as many as a standalone middle school. There are many barriers to equitable scheduling because we offer 3 high school credit-bearing classes, yet there may be 40 students who should be in the class, but there are only 30 slots. What's the recourse for students or families that don't agree with the schedule? Quite honestly, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. People who complain typically are the ones who get their schedule fixed, and my pushback has always been that if a student deserves to be in a class and they don't have an advocate, then why are we changing schedules? And that's a problem that I think that we need to address. So now,
reality check. With our schedule, it's not always equitable and it's not always equal. We, in my school in particular, like I said, we pay attention to our CTE pathways first. That's paramount. And not always do we have people who are a part of the special education staff or a part of the E&L staff always there checking everyone's schedule. A lot of time, so I'm told, there have been times where people will kind of outsource the schedule to someone to help create it who isn't even currently employed in our school or even in our district. So sometimes that can create issues.
When it comes to Ed Smith, the reality is exactly what I said. It's not equitable. When you look at the population of our school, when we look at any classroom, especially those that are giving credit, high school credit, it should be similar to the population of our school, and especially making sure that students of color are getting a chance to be in the seats in those classrooms, especially when they qualify. And if that's not happening, then we need to change our system, which leads us to our next steps.
So for my building, our next steps would be to make sure that all students are being represented, especially our special education and E&L students. when looking at their schedules, because their needs, their IEPs, and their language acquisition needs are paramount and should be paramount. And I think that our scheduling should be around the students and what they need over what the teachers need.
At Ed Smith, one very simple change could be that if there are 3 high school credit-bearing classes, then we should guarantee students that qualify entry into 2 of them instead of entry into all 3, because it locks the schedule. By doing that, we can have more equity in our scheduling.
So next, we want to talk about discipline.
The questions that guided our work about discipline are shown here. One of the biggest things that we wanted to talk about was the restorative justice process, because our code of conduct and the work we do with discipline and the Syracuse City School District is built around restorative justice. And so one of the things we asked was, what does it look like in your building? In my building, the restorative justice process is one that is badly broken and only pieces are used, and oftentimes it has to do with staffing and the amount of time rather than the process. How do you build staff and student buy-in to the restorative justice process? Well, it could work and has worked when students and staff know that it's going to be the same and the process is always going to be worked through. We had spoken about how oftentimes students are returned to class or kicked out of class even without any restoration being built in for students or staff, and that needs to happen. Just because a student goes back to class, they may feel a certain way about their teacher as the teacher might feel about them. The discipline data about my school says that we're doing all right, but again, it can also be misleading because people are often encouraged to send students home and that discipline data is not recorded. What changes with our current code of conduct would help minimize any discipline issues in our building? I think transparency is the #1 thing, and also teaching students strategies from the beginning of their schooling to help them do better when they're coming up against a no.
So at my school, I'm going to mimic a lot of what Karen said, because a lot of it goes right across the board. Restorative justice could look a lot differently in my building, but right now I think that we are only using pieces of the restorative justice model, and because we're only using pieces of it and not using it as a whole or using it the way we're supposed to use it, it's left a bad taste in a lot of teacher and administrators' mouths. So for just a quick example, if 2 students have an altercation and then they're brought to the office and have a quick talk and then they shake hands on it, doesn't necessarily mean that those 2 students are over it. It doesn't mean that anything has been restored, and oftentimes those kids go back to having a similar altercation later on. I think we build staff and student buy-in into restorative justice by doing it with fidelity, by actually doing the way it's supposed to be done, instead of having to try a quick fix. And I don't think that anybody does this maliciously. I think that a lot of people have a lot of things on their plate, and so they're trying to figure out how to be restorative in the fastest way. Our discipline data, we all know that data can show what we want data to show. Our discipline data shows that it's gone down since previous years, but I think that's because we're trying our version of restorative justice by pulling kids in, having them shake hands while they're still breathing hard, and then sending them back to class. And I think if we could make any changes to our code of conduct, what might minimize discipline issues in our building is exactly what Karen said, by being transparent, by having open communication, and by using this model with fidelity instead of taking shortcuts.
And that leads us to our reality check and next step, which we have said more than once, is the reality is it's not implemented with fidelity. And so the next step we think is a very simple one. It should be implemented with fidelity.
Right.
Moving on to our next topic, communication. So
these are the questions that guided our thinking around what we were going to ask our administration about communication. How do you effectively communicate to building and district priorities and initiatives to students, staff, family, and district level personnel? So when I asked my administrator about this, he said that we do a lot of different things. We have a website, we do robocalls, we send out mail, we make phone calls to families, to students. And he was saying that we can do more for communication when it comes to communicating with the community and to parents and to students. Within our school, though, communicating between staff members, it's usually an email or something that happens in like staff meetings or something. So he also expressed that we could probably be doing more to make sure everybody's on the same page with that as well.
And I just mimic exactly what Jasmine says because we have the same systems in place at our building and the same downfalls, which leads us to the reality check is that even though all stakeholders might receive a message, the way they hear it may not be the same way. And so for us, very simple next steps would be, one, making sure that you're giving the same messaging to all people, and then also
making sure that you are diversifying the way that you're giving out your communication. So it's awesome that we send out robocalls, but we have families that speak multiple different languages, and we can't just send the robocalls out in English, for an example.
And our last topic of discussion was about testing. And our questions, oopsie, I'm just going to go back because, we're live, so these are the questions that guided our analysis of testing. And so Jasmine's going to start with what testing looks like at the high school level.
So at the high school level, we don't really have, and I'm talking about our big stake testing, so like our Regents exams, we don't have a say over how many Regents exams they are, or how many times a student can test them or take the test, or how often they can take the tests. And administrators really don't have a say over like STAR assessments, when they're given, how often, or how many assessments are given in the classroom either. When I spoke to the administrator, he kind of just said that he doesn't really agree with everything that we have in place for testing, but he doesn't really see any alternative because this is kind of the way we've always done it. There is a protocol. Of course, stake testing, you have to follow all these rules. And we try to meet all the demands that we can with logistics, making sure that the right kids are taking the right tests, that we have kids split up by their needs and their language. There's a lot.
And at the pre-K to 8 level, we really just give tests starting with STAR in kindergarten. And again, we have the same situation where we don't have a say over it. Administrators don't have a say. And then when you get to 3rd grade through 8th grade, it's the same thing as with Regents. There's a certain way to give them and so on, which brings us to the reality check of there will always be more tests than educators and families and students likely feel comfortable with. But one next step that we could do is that creating a culture where test growth is valued just as much as mastery. That might be one way to make sure that a testing culture isn't one that is aligned with failure or feeling bad. But logistically,
we can also make sure that we're using our staff and that we're working smarter and not harder. So paying attention to which staff members have children that they have to go home to, so you can't use them for those extended tests. Which staff members can stay longer, and how do you compensate them for their time? Do you give them extra money, or do you give them some sort of like compensation in some way? So just thinking about using your resources in the best way.
And that concludes our presentation. We thank you for taking this journey with us and getting to know PSLA and
Ed Smith
a little bit better. Thank you.
See you soon.